some people who make this possible, including Carnegie Corporation of New York, as well as George Washington University, who together help run the PONARS program. So we're delighted to have 4 really interesting speakers today. And I guess the last thing I would say here is just that the topics of their presentations may later become policy memos that will be distributed on our website. So I direct you to that, ponarseurasia.org. So I guess without further ado, let me just get straight to the speakers. I will introduce them in the order they're speaking. So our first speaker is Polina Sinevets, who is Associate Professor in the Department of International Relations at Odessa Mechnikov National University in Ukraine. And her topic today is the Russian Black Sea Fleet. Is there a place for a strategic dimension? So Polina, the floor is yours. Maybe you need to unmute. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Do you hear me? Do you see me? Do you hear me first of all? Okay. I'll try to be not too long. So while trying to discuss the strategic dimension, of course, I meant nuclear dimension because it's my field. So speaking about Russia's recent military exercises, I mean, not recent, but the ones Russia conducted within a year, I would like to emphasize the GROM 2019 military exercises, which was often commented as the simulation of global nuclear war, and also to remind the Navy exercises of the Northern and Black Sea Fleet in the beginning of this year, where Kalibr cruise missile and Kinzhal hypersonic launched ballistic missile were tested. So the question is, of course, the level of nuclear component in the Russia's Black Sea strategy. What questions I'm going to discuss very briefly. So first, the main concept of escalation for de-escalation, which is still operable in the Russian narrative. Then second, the core tendency of the Russian fleet, and in particular the Black Sea Fleet development, and in particular normative, technical or weapons and missions base. So first of all, escalation for de-escalation, probably you all know what it is, but briefly for those who don't remember it. It appeared in 1999, probably as a reaction of Russia for NATO intervention in Yugoslavia, while Russia probably could draw some parallels between its regime and the Yugoslavian regime, and also could identify its weaknesses, in particular the inferiority in conventional weapons in comparison to the West. So in 2000, the new military doctrine appeared, which said that Russia is going to use nuclear weapons under critical circumstances when conventional means prove their inefficiency. Also, the possibility to use nuclear weapons in the regional war was added, and the main mission of using nuclear weapons was the escalation of military actions on terms favorable to Russian Federation. Well, I would not stop at the other documents, but the one which is important is the document from this year, 2020, from June, the basic principle of states policy of the Russian Federation on nuclear deterrence, where the escalation for de-escalation appears in spite of the fact that Russian authorities often deny its existence at all. It said that Russia is going, that the main aim of nuclear weapons is the prevention of escalation of military actions and their termination on conditions that are acceptable for Russian Federation. So what are the values Russia is going to defend with nuclear weapons? First, it's the state existence, which came from the military doctrine of 2014, and then its territorial integrity, which brings us to the annexed Crimea, which is finally codified in Russia's defense perimeter as fait accompli. Again, the vagueness of the nuclear weapons use scale and time also is mentioned in this document, which shows us the possible scenarios of probably the escalatory use of nuclear weapons. Again, coming back to the fleet development, of course, which was started to be accelerated since 2015, maybe even earlier, but the maritime doctrine of 2015 especially emphasized the development of the Black Sea and Azov fleets. And then the fundamentals of the state policy of the Russian Federation in the field of naval operations for the period until 2030, which appeared 2 years later, was very interesting, very explicit in showing that at least Russian Navy is going to be used for, be involved for the escalation actions, because it said that during the escalation of military conflict, the demonstration of readiness and determination to employ non-strategic nuclear weapons capabilities is an effective deterrent. And finally, speaking about the basic principles on nuclear deterrence, again, Russia is speaking about using nuclear weapons in case of attack by adversary against critical military sites, which would undermine nuclear forces' response actions. So if we imagine that the Black Sea Fleet is using its non-strategic nuclear weapons to terminate the conflict, then any use of nuclear weapons against Crimea installations or against the Black Sea Fleet could be interpreted by Russia as the red line for using nuclear weapons. So again, this is already a nuclear dimension of the situation. I would not stop at the whole infrastructure Russia is possessing within its Black Sea Fleet, because it's really huge and we don't have much time. Just a couple of words about the newest weapons, which could be relevant. One of them, a couple of them, they are Kinjal and Zircon, which belongs to the family of so-called March 1st super weapons, announced by the President Putin in his statement to the Federal Assembly in March 2018. Those are hypersonic missiles. Of course, they're all in the process of testing. I mean, Kinjal air-launched ballistic missile and Zircon anti-ship hypersonic sea-launched cruise missile. They're both in the process of testing, but Kinjal was just recently tested in the beginning of this year at the Black Sea. And Zircon has been tested this month, as I remember. Of course, we don't have clear information that it would be used and equipped at the Black Sea fleet. However, as I understand, even the launchers of caliber missiles, which are widely spread and deployed at the Black Sea, are usable for launching a Zircon missile, and therefore it's quite possible, for example. Also, the missile which is very much deployed at the Black Sea is the caliber dual-use sea-launched cruise missile, which has been widely tested in Syria, and also now it's deployed on most of Russian battleships and also in Crimea. So it also has a conventional and nuclear version, and the nuclear carrier is said to have the range of more than 2,000 kilometers, which makes any part of the European NATO territory reachable for this missile. Coming to the missions, as we know, the Black Sea Fleet is not designed for the strategic missions. It's having much more sub-strategic function according to the evaluation of its offensive and defensive capabilities. However, it's pretty much enough to perform sub-strategic operations, including the escalatory options. What are the aims of these capabilities? First of all, of course, it's building A2AD area in the Black Sea, which would help Russia to perform the Black Sea in a sort of a Russian lake, and of course to deny any freedom of NATO military maneuver at the Black Sea. And again, the supportive function for the military Russian operations in Syria. And again, second is the strengthening deterrence of potential threat from NATO. First of all, it's retaining Crimea, which is mentioned as the red line in the deterrence fundamentals. Again, it could be used possibly and targeted at a GS Shore missile defense site in Romania, because as we know, Russia is considering it's not only a defensive function but also an offensive function, which is was demonstrated by the United States, confirmed indirectly by the United States, testing Tomahawk cruise missile from the Aegis Ashore launcher. And also, of course, the potential deployment of the United States intermediate range missiles, which is not happening now, but it will probably going to happen in the couple of nearest years when those missiles with conventional warheads will be ready. But as we know that Russia is not making any difference between conventional and non-conventional intermediate range missiles and any kind of missiles which would be targeted at Russia. And so summing up, the primary focus of the Russian forces, Russian Federation Black Sea Fleet is the creation of the A2AD in the region, which would strengthen Russian deterrence at the southern flank. And due to the combination of the deployment of dual-use weapons and the doctrine, the maritime doctrine, permitting tactical de-escalation, the escalation to support its deterrence is very important, and also it gives a very steady ground to practice coercion, partially diminishing the role of the alliance in the region. So I think that's all, and I think that it's already even too much for the timing. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Paulina. So our next presentation is by Adam Stolberg, who is Sam Nunn Professor and Chair in the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at Georgia Institute of Technology. And his presentation will be on shifting US-Russian trajectories at the nexus of global nuclear commerce and non-proliferation, turning rivals into frenemies. So Adam, take it away.
Okay, well, that was a mouthful. And so as you accurately describe what I'm trying to talk about here in this memo is US-Russian relations really at the nexus of this changing commercial nuclear landscape and its implications for non-proliferation. And for those of you who haven't been paying attention to that shifting commercial nuclear landscape, there really is a power shift, a power transition going on. And across many different indicators. And on the slide here, I've given you a sampling of that. And suffice it to say that the United States at the current moment is really fighting to remain as a significant supplier of civilian nuclear technology, just as Russia is really, aiming to solidify its dominance in this commercial nuclear landscape. And like I mentioned, it's really marked across a number of different indicators here. And this changing landscape or power shift has really become a source of acrimony and consternation, especially in Western strategic circles, and especially those in the United States, both the strategic community and the industry. And one standing official has gone so far to describe the current situation as a vicious circle problem, whereby the United States' slipping position in that civil nuclear arena is leading to a waning of U.S. influence, creating opportunities for Russia today and maybe China in the future to practice predatory practices, and in an effort to do so, really engage in a race to the bottom with their non-proliferation and nuclear security commitments. In other words, lowering those standards as they compete for using unfair, potentially commercial practices. And the net result being an ebbing of the global non-proliferation regime and standards. And so this is really a widespread argument that is, like I said, really rampant across strategic and commercial communities. And since I don't have a long time to go into all of it, I want to give you the bottom line. And part of my research is looking at all facets of that vicious circle argument. And suffice to say, I'd say that it's really premature to count the influence of the United States out, notwithstanding its ebbing stature in the commercial world. There are various reasons why the U.S., I think, can continue to exert influence, but we'll hold that in abeyance for now. But what I want to do is focus on the Russian side. And I would argue that we've really not taken a very complete look at the Russian stature and their foreign commitments, or the nuclear security and non-proliferation commitments attendant to their commercial deals. And when we look at those more systematically, we see a growing frequency and a growing quality of those restrictions associated with those commercial deals. And as a result, the gap is narrowing between the quality of US deals and the quality of Russian deals in the aggregate towards emerging nuclear aspirant states, and even in particularly sensitive regions like the Middle East. And as a result, also when you factor in the characteristics of the supplier states in terms of their export control standards or the risk of theft, in other words, the risk factor, you see that we're much more likely to be engaged in complementary activity as opposed to a race to the bottom activity. And as a result, this more nuanced, complicated empirical understanding of the patterns in both US and Russian foreign commitments to nuclear security and non-proliferation related to their commercial dealings leads me to some optimism. And so in the few minutes, optimism for US-Russian cooperation and for the sanctity of the non-proliferation regime. And so for the few minutes left, I'd like to give you a few vignettes of these empirical patterns that really, ironically, I think, take me to the point where I see the nuclear energy sector as being a potential opportunity for cooperation down the road, as opposed to really the bellwether for geoeconomic dimensions of great power competition, which it is typically characterized. But before I get into the gory details, so to speak, for those students out there, let me remind you that this is really an area that's ripe for research. It is one we haven't really examined carefully the link between the changing commercial business of the nuclear industry and the link to nuclear security and non-proliferation. It's been historically overdetermined. The empirical and quantitative research in this field tends to conflate those state-to-state agreements with private agreements or cooperation agreements, and as a result, we tend not to focus on the formal commitments to nuclear security and non-proliferation. But for the purposes of this talk and this audience, I would argue that the Russian side of the ledger really has not been mined. To the extent that in the Western discourse there's discussion about Russia, it's very stylized. We assume their behavior, we infer their behavior from other dimensions of their energy and economic statecraft. And as a result, we really lack a systematic comparison of US 123 framework agreements and the analogous Russian agreements that embody these commitments to nuclear security and non-proliferation. And in our research, we're looking at this, we're comparing across the aggregate, across different regions, and also looking at the types of customers they look at. So again, let me give you a few vignettes of what it looks like. Because this is strange that we're not doing this. There are about 102 framework agreements between the two parties since 1990 that have been signed or in force. And you can see that that Russia has signed almost half of those agreements since 2010, and certainly since 2007 with the formation of Rosatom and the consolidation of the industry and their very vibrant export strategy. And so what we did was we tried to code these things, and I can get into that in the discussion, but basically we were coding, looking at 4 of the critical quality restrictions that are associated with these agreements that relate to safeguards, direct transfer, the sensitive fuel cycle capabilities of customer states, and retransfers. These are the classic elements of restrictions that are associated with these agreements. And when we sort of aggregate these things and take the averages across those 4, we see a picture that it looks very different than a race to the bottom. And in fact, since 2010, we can see convergence in the aggregate, which is the left slide, also among emerging aspirant states, and also in the Middle East. And I think this tells a very different story when we look at the bigger picture, and we can talk more about it. And it's certainly the case that Russia did have very problematic agreements, especially early on in the first decade. But Russia today is much different than Russia in the 1990s. And that's something that we need to keep in mind. And we can zoom in that in a little bit. You can see here, this is looking at just their deals with nuclear energy aspirant states during this period. And you can see the slope of improvement is quite considerable as opposed to a more conservative approach on the part of the United States. And you get a sense that they're also more frequently signing these agreements in the contemporary period. And as you can see, the quality of these agreements and the quality of the restrictions embedded in these agreements is increasing. Now, this is another look at it. If we look at the nature of the customer state, and this is using on the x-axis a scale, a metric of their export controls, the quality of the export controls. And you can see, of course, the United States had a very gold standard deal with UAE, but that is with a case, and really there are already very high export controls there, as opposed to this upper left quadrant where there are problematic export controls. And you can see that Russia does sign higher quality agreements with those states. The same is true when you look at nuclear security issues. And again, it's the top left quadrant that is the most challenging, where they're the greatest risks. And this one, you can show over time that Russia has actually not only signed these deals, but as the larger circles suggest, these countries have improved their nuclear security policies, at least marginally, during that period. So at the end of the day, I would say this initial take at the empirical ledger shows that we're far from a race to the bottom. The gap is actually both in terms of the quality and the nature of the target or the customer is converging. When we look at the customer more carefully, we see that Russia does take on some higher risk customers than we tend to, and they tend to bring higher quality agreements with those. And so as a result, you see that a much more complementary picture than a zero-sum race to the bottom. And as a result, we have both commercial, I would argue, and strategic reasons to converge and work together. I think both parties are primed to reach some sort of agreement and establish an industry standard for suppliers for signing the additional protocol and dealing with customers. We provide alternative models for customers to work with. And we also have a common interest, both commercial and strategic, not to have a lot of daylight between the two of us that creates opportunities for China down the road to exploit, as we're seeing in Saudi Arabia. And the last word I'd like to say is that, and while the opportunity for cooperation may seem far-fetched these days, for the United States, I think it's important that for domestic reasons, we have an interest to pay heed to these empirical trends, because otherwise this distorted notion that we're engaged in a race to the bottom fuels acrimony, undermines opportunities for our own industries. And as some research from folks at Harvard are suggesting, the more we link the commercial energy space to a proliferation in international security concerns, the less popular support there is for the nuclear industry. So let me turn it back to Henry. Sorry.
Okay, thank you very much, Adam. So next we have Mikhail Troitsky, who is Dean and Associate Professor in the School of Government and International Affairs at Moscow State Institute of International Relations, or MGIMO. He will be presenting on the power of augmented reality, how narratives impacted U.S.-Russian post-Cold War arms control negotiations. So Mikhail, over to you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Henry, and I hope everyone can hear me and see my first slide. So I suggest we talk a little bit about the ups and downs in U.S.-Russia arms control negotiations over the last 30 years or so, and discuss the role of narratives in those negotiations. So, and this is based on a piece of research I did for a collective project, and policy memo is also an option, but I'll have to discuss it with the editors of the volume. Anyway, in my view, what is really exciting about U.S.-Russia arms control negotiations and agreements is the politics, not the technicalities of the U.S.-Russia arms control. Arms control never drives politics. It is very much secondary to politics. And only when domestic and international politics that the negotiating countries are involved in is right, can a substantive arms control deal be expected to happen, to go through. And I tried arguing recently in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists that perceived stability of intentions has been key to successful arms control deals between Russia and the United States. And those intentions could could be confrontational or cooperative, but the sides really had to believe that they were not in for some unpleasant surprise from their counterparts as they were negotiating. Unpleasant surprise such as a brazen geopolitical maneuver coming their way, or a new technology being weaponized that could have potentially disruptive effects for the balance of power between them. And it is important that we do not confuse the process of arms control negotiations with closure of those negotiations in the form of an agreement. Just negotiating on arms control is one thing, but closing deals is a very different thing. So you negotiate for a host of different reasons and purposes. You want to collect information, you want to get a feel of your counterpart's thinking, and so on. But reaching a deal, hammering out a deal, requires very favorable conditions that in the US-Russia case have included credible stability of intentions. Now, perceived stability of intentions seems not to be sufficient. It is necessary, but it is not sufficient. And the history of US-Russia arms control negotiations seems to show that there needs to be what I figuratively call steroids, or an anesthetic for such negotiations to close successfully instead of dragging on for years and then fading out, which has, by the way, most often been the case. Because those negotiations and those deals, especially deals, are genuine security and political minefields, and therefore arms control deals really need to be made on steroids or anesthetics, to put it in a figurative way. So I looked at several cases in US-Russia negotiations, and I think that I can argue that dominant mainstream narratives about the mission and purpose of the foreign policies of negotiating parties may have served as the anesthetic that enabled arms control deals. Now, quickly, what is narrative? It is a story which is emotionally appealing, but which has been to some extent made up, meaning that it is not completely logical, or it may rely on unverified information. So in a way, a narrative augments reality for a number of purposes. For example, to give consolation to someone, or to serve as a mobilizing tool for a group, or as a way of signaling intention. And we are interested here in the signaling function of the narrative. So imagine you and I are ready to publicly accept a story that somehow unites us, while that story doesn't sound fully convincing to many other people. And in that case, if we are ready to sign up to that story, to accept such a story, such a narrative, then we can perhaps build trust and make a deal. So how did narratives enable or hamper US-Russia arms control deals? And my argument is that when the mainstream underlying foreign policy narratives in both countries focused on security, arms control deals went through and hatched really relatively easily. But when those narratives pivoted around identity, at least for one side, or when there was no clear shared uniting narrative, then negotiations dragged on or broke down. So there were essentially two periods of successful US-Russia arms control solutions and closures. Now, so the first one happened in the late 80s and early 90s, and the second one during the short window between 2009 and 11. And the reasons for those windows were not trivial from my perspective. It was not because, for example, as some in Russia would suggest, Moscow was selling out its national interest or giving up on its national interest and accepting unfavorable deals under pressure by the United States. In fact, what we are seeing right now is that Russia is looking to salvage the New START that it signed with the United States in 2010, while the United States is dragging its feet on extending the New START. So the New START clearly wasn't about selling out Russia to the United States. And even Gorbachev apparently didn't sell Russia out in 1987 when he signed the INF Treaty, which Moscow is now saying it wanted to preserve, while the United States just pulled out of it at some point. So my answer. So basically, why did we have those two arms control periods as blips in the midst of decades of consistent failures to reach meaningful arms control deals? And my answer to this question has to do with shared narratives of collective security. So for Gorbachev, it was his new political thinking that both U.S. Presidents Reagan and H.W. Bush generally endorsed. And there are plenty of accounts of the role of new political thinking in building the arms control momentum between Moscow and Washington back then. It is a little bit more difficult to distill a shared collective security narrative during the times of US-Russia reset, but the dynamic there was very similar to the times of new political thinking, I would suggest. Only the sides switched roles. President Obama was talking about nuclear disarmament as a priority for building peace early in Obama's first term, while President Medvedev in Russia, like Reagan in the 80s, was looking to improve relations with the other side. So Medvedev signed up to Obama's narrative of nuclear disarmament in the London Declaration of 2009, and then came out arguing that the New START was good for Russian security. Now, in between and after those two short-lived periods of successful closure, we had longer times of protracted, fruitless negotiations, or just no arms control negotiations whatsoever, most of the 90s, and then the subsequent decade were the times of what I would call narrative flux. We had no clear distinguishable trend emphasizing shared security, but instead we had plenty of mutual disappointment and recrimination. And if you look closely enough, you can identify statements by leading policymakers in Russia and the United States linking those disappointments to the lack of rationale for arms control deals. Just look at the story surrounding the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty that apparently fell hostage to the narratives of divided security in post-Soviet Eurasia. And then I'm nearing the end, and then after 2012, the crisis of arms control clearly correlated with the fashionable identity narrative of newly emerged great power politics on the global scale. And in fact, there is evidence of even some causality. Just listen to the threats of sending the other side into oblivion in a world of completing great powers, or listen to the assertions of great power status by deploying new weapon systems, advanced weapon systems. So the underlying identity narrative has been very divisive and detrimental to arms control. And so if you are looking for a takeaway or two from my brief talk, it is first that arms control negotiations never come to a successful closure without the parties' intentions being verifiably stable and no surprises in the pipeline, in the making. And shared narratives are effective means of signaling such intentions and building the necessary trust. And second, by implication, arms control will never succeed as a sideshow to the mainstream trend in US-Russia relations. And actually, the portrayal of this very mainstream trend is the narrative that can either enable or discourage arms control, not vice versa. So no end to the arms control crisis in sight before the mainstream narrative of the relationship is reversed. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Mikhail. So our fourth and final speaker of the day is Dmitry Gorenberg, who is Senior Research Scientist at CNA and Associate at the Davis Center at Harvard University. and he will be presenting on the Russian military in the Arctic and expanding presence. And just before I hand things over to Dmitry, let me just say that I'll be collecting questions now. So if you have them, go ahead and formulate them, and then I'll pose some questions to the speakers after Dmitry's done. So over to you.
Great. Thank you, Henry, and thanks to Ponars for organizing these events. I think it's been really great to keep everyone engaged over the last couple months and beyond. So I'm going to be talking about the kind of the military dimension of Russia's objectives in the Arctic. And I don't have any slides, so just have to bear with me talking. And there will be I'll be putting together a memo on this. I'll be available. I don't know. I'm not sure how quickly these things work out, but in a couple of months, I imagine. So what are the key drivers of Russia's policy in the Arctic? The main strategic objectives were spelled out in an official document that was published earlier this year, called in Russian, it's об основах государственной политики Российской Федерации в Арктике, so the kind of the bases of Russian state policy in the Arctic. And this document largely confirms what I've written in the past, which is continues that Russia's Arctic policy is pursued on two very much divergent tracks. So first, there's kind of the international cooperation aspect to assure, primarily focused on assuring the development of the region's resources. So oil and gas exploration is key here, but also increasingly the Northern Sea route. So that's already navigable for part of the year. So far, it's been used primarily for transit to and from Russian ports. But there has been a little bit of an increase in cross transit between Asia and Europe, and Russia certainly hopes that there will be more in the future. Now, for both of these, and especially for the oil and gas exploration, Russia's felt the need for cooperation, international cooperation, to really get it going. Originally, this was primarily with the West, and since the deterioration of relations with the West, it's been more and more with China. So China's gotten involved with some natural gas projects in the Arctic. There's also the concept of the Polar Silk Road. So China's becoming more and more of a player in the Arctic on its own, but also in partnership with Russia in some extent. The second aspect of the second track is focuses on an effort to highlight Russian sovereignty over the largest portion of the Arctic, which Russia controls by virtue of its geography. And this has historically, and in the recent past as well, included some fairly bellicose rhetoric, and also the military buildup, which I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about. So there's this kind of a balancing act in these two dimensions, which Katerina Zisk has recently described as a working relationship between economic optimism and security pessimism, and I kind of like that phrase, so I'm borrowing it here. Now, one thing to note is that since the start of Putin's third term, so since 2012, and especially since the Ukraine crisis, the balance between those two tracks has shifted more and more towards the second track, though international cooperation hasn't completely been foreclosed. So after 2014, Russian leaders have feared an increased likelihood of conflict in the region due to a combination of an increased competition for natural resources, a decrease in sea ice as a natural barrier and as a defense for Russia, combined with insufficient Russian resources in the region, and then overlaid with a spillover or fears of a spillover of the overall deterioration in Russia's relationship with the West. So this has led Russia over the last 6 to 8 years to really engage in an effort to modernize its military infrastructure, including efforts that have in turn been seen by some of its neighbors in the Arctic as potentially threatening. So we saw in December 2014 the establishment of a separate Arctic Joint Strategic Command, which has been focused on the Northern Fleet, but also includes 2 specialized ground forces brigades. Also, expansion of air forces, air defense, coastal defense, and then most recently an announcement that starting in 2021, there will be a full military district, a 5th military district based on the Northern Fleet. So let me just very quickly go through some of the key developments in terms of the military buildup. This has been focused primarily on the Western Arctic. There have been several new bases, new ports and airfields in pretty remote areas. So Rogachova and Novaya Zemlya, Sredny and Severная Zemlya, Nagurskaya and the Franz Joseph Archipelago are really kind of being built up as relatively full-fledged bases. In some of the locations, there's going to be MiG-31 fighter jets, and they'll be capable, and the bases will be capable of receiving large transport bomber and anti-submarine warfare aircraft. Some of the bases are also going to be equipped for S-300 air defense and hypersonic missiles, including potentially the Zircon and Kinzhal missiles that Paulina mentioned earlier in her presentation. So there's also new bases in the central and the eastern Arctic, but these are primarily being focused on the protection of sea routes and search and rescue operations. So these are in Novosibirsk Islands and Wrangel Islands and Cape Schmidt. They're also building up new radar stations and air defense missile systems as well. In some cases, it's possible, and this maybe connects a little bit to Adam's presentation. Russia's building floating nuclear power plants, which is kind of an innovation and something that they're also talking about exporting in the future. And they may provide power for some of these new facilities down the road. Now, the first one, the Academic Lomonosov, came online in 2019 and is being used in Chukotka for civilian purposes. But there is talk of down the road they may be used for military purposes as well. Russia's also building up monitoring capabilities in the region with a goal of building a unified surveillance system with both satellite and aerial components. And it's also developing new maritime patrol aircraft to replace its existing Il-38s down the road. For the Navy, there's an effort to build ice-class ships, both for the Navy and the Coast Guard. So the Navy is getting 2 ice-class patrol ships. These are pretty large 6,800-ton ships, armed with the Kaliber missiles and eventually with Zircon as well. Also 4 icebreakers to help its non-ice class ships get around in the Arctic. Coast Guard's getting 2 patrol ships as well. And I should just note that in terms of icebreakers, Russia is building a lot of new icebreakers and is well on its way to having more icebreakers in the active than all the other Arctic countries combined. So that's a component as well. Let me just very briefly say a couple words about the accelerated exercise program that the Russian military has been conducting in the Arctic. They first really got going in that region in 2012 with an exercise to protect civilian facilities. In 2013, they resumed regular naval and naval aviation patrols in the Arctic. Previously, the Northern Fleet kind of mostly just sailed into the Atlantic. Now they're doing a lot more going east and doing Arctic patrols. The Air Force is patrolling the region. The long-range bomber flights were resumed in 2007. So in terms of goals, the exercises are primarily aimed at demonstrating Russia's capability, commitment, and resolve to protecting the North. So, for example, in 2017, there was a simulation of a bombing attack on a Norwegian radar facility. Russia's used electronic warfare to try to disrupt NATO exercises in the region. There's also an effort to work on redeploying assets across remote theaters of operations to try to improve interoperability across the services and across geographic regions. So there is, what I want to say is that there is definitely a military buildup in the Arctic, but I at the same time don't want to overstate the extent of the hostility or the potential for hostility. Or at the same time as it's been building up the military, Russia has settled a lot of some of its key maritime border disputes, particularly with Norway, and it's continued to work through international legal channels regarding control of the Lomonosov Ridge. through UNCLOS. There's still a lot less military infrastructure in the region than there was during the Cold War, and that's something we have to remember. The buildup is still nowhere near Cold War levels. Russia's still cooperating in the Arctic Council, and there's a lot, and then particularly in that venue, there's a lot of odd bedfellow situations. So, for example, Russia and Canada are on the same side versus the U.S. and China on issues like the status of international straits, where the countries that have the straits there, that the go through have the straits going through their countries, have very different priorities than outsider countries. There's also alliances where the full members of the Arctic Council are sometimes team up against observers such as China. So the Russia-China relationship sometimes gets in the way of that. So let me just conclude by giving you a little bit of consideration of what conditions could lead to greater cooperation or competition in the region. So first of all, in terms of cooperation, Russia is really more interested in cooperation in this region than anywhere else. So like I said, it's continuing to work through the international institutions, and if it sees offers for cooperation through those venues, they're likely to be reciprocated. Although the overall market trends have for now postponed any efforts to develop Russia's Arctic offshore energy resources, Russia does need most likely Western assistance. They're the only ones with the capabilities for those kind of, harsh climate offshore energy exploration. So any long-term plans to develop offshore energy is going to need cooperation with probably Norway, Germany, maybe even the United States. Russia also needs to develop cooperative regimes to expand commercial use of the Northern Sea Route. That really requires international cooperation. So those kinds of factors may lead down the road to de-emphasizing military competition. Now, conditions for competition, I'll just end with this. If there is a Western focus on the use of military in the region, if there are more efforts to send naval forces or air forces to the Arctic, Russia will see that as a threat and will reciprocate. Also, if there's a rejection of the UNCLOS process or strong security-focused reaction by whichever side loses the Lomonosov Bridge dispute, once that decision comes down, that could also spur competition, maybe not necessarily military, but certainly security-based. So I'll stop there, and I'm looking forward to the questions.
Okay, terrific. So I think we have 4 very interesting and informative presentations to work with. So I've gotten a number of questions. I think at this point, maybe I will just give one question to begin to each panelist, and then we can come back for other rounds. So first of all, to Polina, there's a question about how much Russia and Turkey are cooperating on the Black Sea, and is that affecting NATO's general strategy? For Adam, there's a question about whether you could say a bit more about who the main actors are involved in kind of the commercial nuclear arena, and the degree to which they are is it just states or are kind of other non-state actors or quasi-state actors or kind of commercial interests playing a lead role here? So how does that relate? And to Mikhail, as a question, actually a couple of questions on comparisons to the Cold War. And so I guess I might invite any of the other speakers. I mean, you're all experts in this topic. If you want to weigh in on those questions, there's a general question about how similar today's kind of nuclear competition between the U.S. and Russia is to Cold War period. And then from Alexander Chang, a little more specific question on observing that the U.S. and the Soviet Union were able to negotiate during or right after periods of high tension and produce really productive and have productive negotiations with SALT 1, SALT 2, the INF Treaty. And so the question there is kind of what are some of the qualitative differences between Cold War tensions and the current deterioration in relations between U.S. and Russia today? that seem to be making progress on arms control more difficult. And then finally, to Dmitry, from Henri Nicolas Grossman, which is the Russian foreign policy concept of 2016 says that Russia will bracket its relations in the Arctic from the broader rift with NATO. So are American policymakers capable of seizing on this possibility to cooperate on climate change and China? So that should be a good first round. So let's just go back in the order that the speakers presented. So let's start with Paulina.
Yes. My question is about cooperation of Russia with Turkey and how much it affects NATO goals in the region and NATO strategy, as I understood, right? So I think that, of course, today it's a quite anxious. The situation looks quite anxious because Turkey was the first to be invited into Russian Caucasus 2020 military trainings, and the deal about buying us 400 missile defense systems, and also the idea to cooperate with. After finding out the gas places in the Black Sea, the idea of cooperating with Russia even more, which was put forward by Turkey. It's all, and also the fact that being rejected by in the new round of for the membership in EU, Turkey has also expressed its will to join the SCO. It's all looks like quite an anxious signs of growing, I would say, growing problems in the relations between NATO and Turkey, and the fact that Russia is, as usual, successfully using the cracks to make a real break between the allies. Still, I think for now it's the situation is not critical in the way that Turkey is a member of NATO in its NATO ally, and it's not. Of course, it's now drifting a little bit away from it, but it's still in the alliance. And I think that since that critical problems are not aggravating, there is still a chance to retain Turkey in NATO, to involve it more, and it probably will depend on the next. I mean, maybe next steps of NATO will do in the relations with Turkey, and also maybe it will depend on the elections in the United States and the US strategy. So I think that now there is a huge potential of problems for Russia to take advantage of, obviously, and Russia is always very wise in doing that, in trying to settle a quarrel between the allies, and it's really dangerous at the moment. But still, I think that there's still some potential to bring Turkey back to NATO and to involve it a little bit more, pointing it out its obligations with the NATO and the opportunities, moreover, the opportunities which NATO membership gives. Yeah, I hope I have answered a little bit, but maybe it was not so satisfactory. Anyway, this is my answer.
Okay, great, thank you, Adam.
Okay, this is a great question about the different commercial interests, and this is also a long story that we don't have time to get into, but let me just tell you that this is related to why I'm both optimistic about cooperation and also for U.S. competitiveness. Of course, on the U.S. side, we have more, this is run by private companies that are engaged, and private companies are making decisions about civil nuclear based on their commercial interests, and natural gas obviously is having a big impact on some of those decisions. It's also related to the decision of who our customers are going to be. And those high-risk customers that I pointed out to you before tend not to be as attractive to the bottom line. On the other hand, on the Russian side of the ledger, and by the way, when the U.S. does business these days, and U.S. companies do business, we're primarily involved in consortia. And these consortia are global in nature. And within these consortia, the United States companies tend to act and tend to have more influence over our partners than would be suggested by looking at who the vendor of the last contract is, or of supply chains. And so this could be a potential avenue for the U.S. to have influence over other suppliers. On the Russian side, of course, you have a state-run company that's consolidated since 2007 under Rosatom, and part of their mandate is to be responsible for both not only the commercial side, but also upholding Russia's non-proliferation commitments. And so while a lot of attention's been paid to what are perceived to be unfair business practices and using these build, own, operate opportunities for Russia to outcompete, let's say, United States companies, not enough attention's paid to the fact that they are beholden to upholding the credible commitments by Russia to non-proliferation and nuclear security, which was really the emphasis of my talk. And so this is really the question really gets to the heart of the industry and the challenges of looking at dynamics in the industry to nuclear security and non-proliferation. But I think that they lead in the direction that is suggested by my presentation. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you. Mikhail.
Yes, thank you, Henry, and everyone asking questions. So mine was about Cold War comparisons to the current situation, I believe. So I'm just going to answer those two questions in one go. And basically, I would claim that my theory of intention stability as facilitator for arms control basically is valid for the whole period of arms control as we know it, going back to early 1970s, late 1960s in its current form. And it kind of can be applied, this view can be applied throughout that period. So whenever intentions were perceived as being stable, and the first case of such stability or confrontational stability, however, of course, was in the early 1970s when the United States was apparently bogged down in Vietnam, while the Soviet Union had issues with China and was lagging behind economically. So the sides somehow figured out that they needed each other in a way, and that they needed to draw a certain line under the arms race that had been going on over the previous couple of decades. But as soon as suspicions started growing of both sides trying to turn the table somehow to pull surprise maneuvers, such as Soviet interventionism in the Third World, Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia. As long as that started happening, and of course Afghanistan, climaxing in Afghanistan, then all arms control deals started falling apart and negotiations began to drag on, and then they collapsed, of course, amidst the November 1983 crisis. And then it sort of bounced back on the agenda as Gorbachev and his U.S. counterparts began stressing their shared security, new political thinking, and apparently at that point narratives played a role in convincing the U.S. side of the Soviet non-aggressive, non-expansionist intentions, and then arms control worked out, and it worked for a few years, and then let's just jump to the current situation that I think I was asked to compare to the Cold War situation of confrontational stability that still facilitated, that was still good enough to facilitate and enable arms control agreements. So why apparently the Cold War has long been over. And we had some arms control during the Cold War, both in the 70s and then in the late 80s, while now we have almost none of it, and it's just falling apart. And it also has to do with instability of intentions and the lack of an appropriate facilitating narrative. So apparently, and I just sent a response to Peter Rutland. I believe that everyone might be able to see, and basically the argument here that right now we have mutual scares of new expansionism in the intentions of both sides. So Russia apparently is very much concerned with new political mobilization technologies being used against Russia for the purposes of regime change, while the United States says, okay, and you are leveraging all sorts of hybrid technologies and cyber espionage also for the purposes of interference in our politics, and also destabilizing other countries and so forth. So intentions are clearly now perceived as much more unstable and being in flux, in a bad flux, than they were back in the early 70s. So that is the main difference. I'll stop here.
Okay, great. So let's move on to Dmitry.
Great, thanks. So my question was about the extent to which Russia's relationship with the West and with NATO in the Arctic can be bracketed from the rest of the broader rift. And I think Russia would be happy with that to the extent that it's possible. I think that was certainly their goal. They found it harder going than they might have expected originally. There was a time, I'll just go back to 2014, 2015, when they were really hopeful to bracket all of international relations, or to bracket the Ukraine crisis, let's put it that way, and try to keep everything else going. And part of their efforts in the Middle East, for example, and in Syria, were to break out what they saw as a very negative isolation by forcing the West to engage with Russia in other theaters. So the Arctic was very much a part of that. Now, the extent to which that's actually feasible down the road, I think that the West doesn't play that way nearly as well or as much as Russia does. So the United States in particular tends to have kind of a more totalizing foreign policy where you're either our friend or you're our enemy. Or you could be a neutral, but for as far as important countries, it's one or the other. And so it becomes very difficult to disentangle the hostile relationship that between the U.S. and Russia in other spheres from the possibility of cooperation in the Arctic. Europe has done a somewhat more nuanced, has had a more nuanced policy where it can both engage in fairly recognize the tension and build up NATO and build up military forces while continuing cooperation on energy, for example, and various other economic kinds of cooperation. So there's more, I think there's more chance for that kind of cooperation between Western Europe and the EU and Russia than between the U.S. and Russia. And just since China was mentioned in the question, just a couple of words on the possibility of cooperation on China between the U.S. and Russia is remote in any, in any region, Arctic, non-Arctic, it doesn't matter, because the interests of, at the moment, the interests of Russia and China are much more aligned than the interests of, say, the U.S. and Russia versus China. So I think that there is maybe a misguided fantasy in some circles in Washington that that the U.S. could pursue some policies that could create a wedge between Russia and China, and I just don't see that as a likely to be effective. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. Let me go to another round of questions now. Go to each. I'll just pose them one question or so to each panelist, but maybe this time we'll go in the reverse order. So let Dmitry speak first. And so, question to Dima is, how do Russia's sovereignty-oriented efforts compare with actions of other Arctic states? To Mikhail, this is actually, this one comes from, and I'm just interested in, I mean, first of all, if one talks about the stability of intentions, right? I mean, I think your argument makes a lot of sense. It's really interesting, but it does. I'm interested, I guess, in particular in the 2009, 2011 heyday of arms control talks that you mentioned. It seems strange, first of all, that like the stability of intentions would be greater under the tandem under Medvedev than under Putin. Because wasn't there kind of a reconvergence, a kind of a new unity of stability of tensions in tensions in Russia after that. And I guess more generally, I'd be interested for you to talk a little bit more about what you think drove the sides in 2009, 2011 promoting narratives. So in Russia, like, for example, I mean, was it really just the arrival of Medvedev to the presidency? And kind of after that, then does that mean kind of with Putin back, there's really no hope of this until whenever we get a new president? Or similarly in the U.S., is this just a product of Obama? And I think kind of the broader question, just for policy and in theory, is what will it take? What will it take for new narratives to emerge of the kind that could kind of combine with stability of intentions whenever they emerge to promote arms control? So then to Adam, question is, could you say a bit more about how technological change could impact the viciousness or virtue of the circles that you talk about, the cycles you talk about? And then finally to Polina, how ready would Turkey be to bottle up the Black Sea Fleet in a conflict to support NATO, if it ever comes to that? So let's go to Dmitry first, and then we'll kind of go back in reverse order.
Great, thanks for that. So in terms of, and there's a lot of similarities in certain ways in terms of in how the various Arctic states act in pursuing their sovereignty claims, especially when it comes to UNCLOS and the Commission on the Law of the Sea, and that has been assigned the responsibility for adjudicating the various maritime territorial claims in the region. And the states have all submitted kind of rival claims, or not all, but most of the states have submitted rival claims, and they're letting the process work out. And so from that point of view, there's a lot of similarities. They're also very, as I kind of very briefly mentioned in my presentation, Canada and Russia are the two states that have what are legally considered international straits going through their territory, the Northwest Passage in Canada and the Northern Sea Route in Russia. And they both have very similar positions on how they want to control those versus other countries that don't have such straits going through their territories that want a lot more international supervision. So there is kind of a very much national interest perspective that dominates all, I think, of the Arctic states. There is the one area where Russia has acted differently is that Russia has over a long, I think more or less throughout the Putin leadership period, I was hesitant to say presidency because part of that time he wasn't president. There have been a series of symbolic actions that Russia has undertaken in the Arctic that were designed to kind of, for both international and especially for domestic audiences, to highlight that Russia's back, that Russia controls its territory. The most kind of famous one that got a lot of attention was when they planted a titanium Russian flag on the bottom of the sea in this part of this territory that they claimed. So these kinds of actions, and also some of them, the military patrols, they kind of started that. So that was really kind of these efforts to highlight for public consumption the claim, the Russia's sovereignty status in the Arctic. And I think that Russia, for various reasons having to do with status and in the international system, is much more insecure, or was at least, maybe not so now, but for many years was much more insecure about that status than other countries, and therefore did more of those kinds of symbolic actions than other Arctic states. But other than that, I think that so far, at least, they've been pursuing very similar kinds of actions, mostly in the diplomatic sphere, rather than any kind of military actions. And so for that reason, it's been roughly parallel.
All right, great. So let's move on to Mikhail.
Yeah, thank you, Henry, for your great question. So basically, what drove the size in the 2009 to 2011 reset to seek narratives promoting arms control? Well, basically, I would name the economic crisis that seemed to be unraveling at that time, and it scared everyone, and everyone apparently had to deliver. If you were a politician such as the US or Russian president, then expectations were high, and also the feeling was strong that responding to the 2008 and 9 crisis required concerted action, right, on the part of broad international community like G20 instead of G8 and so on and so forth. That was one reason for the sides to look for unifying or uniting narratives or narratives of unity. But then there certainly was this usual dynamic of a reset, of a US-Russia reset that we already had, we already saw happening at least 4 times, at the beginning of each decade, more or less, and then also in some kind of mild form between Presidents Trump and Putin since the beginning of President Trump's term in the United States. That's basically, let's just try something new, let bygones be bygones, and let's see what we can figure out. So 2 new leaders was indeed a strong reset, right? Was indeed contributed to a strong reset spirit, to a strong spirit of wanting to try something new. And the third factor, I would say, was had to do with attempts at visionary agendas. So both Obama and Medvedev had visionary agendas, and they were essentially non-status quo agendas, let's put it that way. So Obama wanted to change things, and he got his Nobel Peace Prize, and he was, very enthusiastic about his ability to really, make a difference. And I guess the same applied to the Russian president, who wanted to kind of emancipate a little bit to show that he is an autonomous figure capable of his own, policy. So, and now, what does it take for a new narrative to emerge now, kind of confirming the stability of intentions and facilitating arms control? And I think basically we can draw upon this first question to get a glimpse of, to get an idea of how to to address the second one. So basically, what is needed, I guess, again, a blank slate. Turn the page, somehow let bygones be bygones. And then I think what is even more important is is realization, because we cannot hope for another, reset, for another constellation of actors, of stars that would make it as favorable a situation as it was in 2009 for arms control. So we need some kind of realizations that benefits of arms control politically outweighs, because politics always comes first. So they outweigh politically the costs, whichever costs, both domestic political costs and foreign policy costs, right? And then if there's a realization that that a narrative of shared something, of a narrative of unity is going to benefit the advocates of such narrative politically at home and abroad, then I think we will soon see such narrative to emerge, and that was the case with Gorbachev and Western leaders in the 80s, and to an extent Medvedev and Obama. So I think this is what it takes to give an impetus to arms control. But of course, there are plenty of other considerations related to national interest, and so they need to be uncontroversial in a situation when the sides discuss whether they are to engage in a new round of arms control. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Adam.
So great question. And ultimately, at the end of the day, I see that technological innovation and its diffusion in the civil nuclear sector does hold the promise for supporting more of that virtuous circle that I noted. I think for several reasons. One is these systems like small modular reactors or Generation 4 reactors have passive non-proliferation and nuclear security advantages. So just their mere diffusion is going to help break the link between the spread of commercial nuclear technology and these negative externalities of proliferation and insecurity. And for the United States, I think it also can bolster our competitiveness, at least in niche areas, for those customers of small modular reactors. I mean, we've just been licensing. Now we've made some progress towards licensing. In that regard, I think that is an opportunity for the United States. Also in Gen 4, we're in cooperation, and we're in corporate strategic alliances where we have influence over those. But at the end of the day, it's my reading that those two technologies and the future technologies are going to be more in niche areas, and it's not going to take us to all of these other markets. And as a result, Russia and later down the road, China are going to be continuing to be major players. And the types of processes and trends that I mentioned in terms of their foreign security and non-proliferation commitment, especially Russia's, is something that we need to pay attention to. And again, I would argue the more we use the canard of Russia having, at least in the contemporary period, very low non-proliferation nuclear standards as a way to somehow buttress our nuclear industry, as I mentioned, I think that's not resonating with popular support for the nuclear industry. And for all the good intentions that politicians may have to support our nuclear industry, they may foreclose those niche industry opportunities in the future with sapping support for subsidies and other types of incentives for those promising technological innovations in SMRs and Gen 4.
All right, great. Paulina.
Okay, I have a question. How likely Turkey will be to bottle up the Black Sea fleet of NATO in case of conflict with Russia, right? Yes. Okay, so I don't think that things have gone so far that Turkey will be able to do this. First, it's the NATO member, still the member of the alliance, and it didn't leave it yet. And second, I think that in case of conflict between NATO and Russia, it won't be limited just to the Black Sea, so Turkey won't be able to prevent the conflict. Therefore, I think that in case of conflict, I can draw here the parallel maybe between the situation of what Romania was considered during the Soviet Union, right? Romania was the member. I mean, it was the member of the Soviet bloc. Still, it was not a really reliable member of the Soviet bloc. However, there was the sort of the common truth that in case of conflict, Romania will be still on side of the Soviet Union, and they say that they're bastards, but they're our bastards. So in this regard, I think that Turkey also has. It has not such a good reputation of being, I mean, during the latest time of being the faithful alliance member, but it's still the alliance member. I think that it will be following its obligations according to Article 5, because I don't think that there are any other reasons of starting a conflict between NATO and Russia, except Article 5 would be broken somehow or breached. Therefore, I think that it's not really likely.
Okay, so for a final round of questions, I have one specific one and then one kind of general one for whoever wants to take it. So the specific one, apologies, I'm only getting to it now, is from Braden Pugh, who asks, back in February, the U.S. referenced developing a new SLBM warhead, the W-93. Do you think that American development of new warheads represents an escalation in U.S.-Russian nuclear relations, or is it immaterial given Russia's ongoing expansion of their own nuclear capabilities? And the second question is just one that I'll toss out there. I've been doing a little research on U.S.-Russian mutual perceptions with my colleague Olga Kamenchuk at Northwestern University. And one of the findings that we had was that raising the fear of nuclear war really wasn't enough to shape or kind of really push people to supporting different kinds of policies that might be different forms of compromise in international relations, or kind of push people towards various forms of negotiations and arms control. So I wonder, just from your perspective as experts on strategic issues, are policymakers, at least in your analysis, like putting the weight that they should on the dangers involved in nuclear conflict? Should we be focusing on that more, or are they doing about the right amount, or just kind of in general, how much are these considerations kind of weighing in foreign policy elites, foreign policy making? So we have about 1 minute left for each panelist on average. So maybe let's just start with Paulina. We'll just go back in the original order and just we can wrap up. So Paulina.
Okay, as for the new warhead, as I understand, it's everything is designed to not to lower the threshold, the nuclear threshold, but just to raise it, and just to let Russia know that the United States won't be paralyzed by any kind of regional escalation for the escalation strategies of Russia. Therefore, they will be able to do something and to have a nuclear response for any nuclear provocation. And it's made not for starting a nuclear war. It's made just to show Russia that they should not use nuclear weapons for escalation for the escalation scenario, right? So it just aimed to raise the deterrence. I don't know whether it will work properly, but it was designed just for this. And next question is about the fear in this of the potential nuclear conflict. I think that the fear should be that it's a positive thing, but today it's much more complicated to settle. I mean, this fear to settle it down, because there are so many kinds of low-yield nuclear weapons, dual-use weapons, and other stuff, which blurs the line between conventional nuclear warheads. And now nuclear conflict can just appear from the conventional one, and no one would really understand at what point it happened. So I think that the main issue is today to draw the attention to the easiness how the conventional conflict can transform into nuclear one, and then it will be too late to de-escalate. Sorry, yes. Maybe I'm done with the answering. Right.
Okay, thank you.
So Henry, your observation that sort of existential mutual threats are never enough to bring the parties together, my research suggests that overstating negative externalities or negative security threats is bad for business. It only pours fuel on toxic political relations. And ultimately opens the door for third parties that can come in with a lot lower standards. So I would argue that manufacturing or overstating existential threats is actually more detrimental than trumpeting mutual existential threats to sort of advance a cooperative agenda. So I think it plays differently.
Okay, yeah, very interesting. Yeah, thanks. Mikhail.
Yeah, quickly. Thank you, Henry. So to your question about fears of nuclear war, I think, and the question was whether we should be focusing on it now, whether it can help us to pull off some arms control. And I believe that just becoming obsessed with the dangers of a nuclear war isn't enough as sides engage in brinkmanship. And as sides have deep mistrust in each other's intentions, and that they believe that their intentions are expansionist and aggressive. And I think it might even be counterproductive, as it might be considered an attempt to just lull the other side, or to use this peace movement in order to just basically to lull the other side into negligence and distract its attention. So basically, my point is that what needs to be addressed simultaneously with having this risk of an existential danger in mind is the balance of political costs and benefits of brinkmanship that may lead to a war. Right? And we need at least to think about what it may take to change the balance. We need to imagine scenarios where that balance is going to be different, and that is going to be much more conducive to a frank conversation about the future of arms control and the ways of overcoming the crisis. And the warhead, that was the other question. I think it's immaterial. It's immaterial because the general public doesn't care about warheads and intricacies of nuclear balances, and real policymakers in their turn understand what is going on, and they understand it well enough, so they understand what a particular move by their counterpart is meant to respond to. So their readiness to escalate doesn't depend on that very move. It depends again on the politics of the relationship, on the balance of costs and benefits, of political costs and benefits of doing one thing or another. Thank you.
Thank you. Final word to Dmitry Gorenberg.
Great, thanks. These are all great answers. I don't have a lot to add, so just very briefly, I just want to highlight that as bad as the relationship seems now, and as unstable as things seem, we should, things in retrospect, things seem to have been better in the past. We should remember that the Cold War was also a time of great uncertainty and hostility, and the risks of nuclear war at the time, I think if we, for people who lived at that time, were much higher than they seem to us now. And I think that's really the way it was then, not just sort of a differences in perception. So I do think that as bad as the relationship between the West and Russia is right now, we are still in a much better place than we were for most of the Cold War, except, at the very end. I'll stop there.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thanks to all of our panelists for a really interesting discussion. Just before I conclude, I'll highlight that our next week's Ponar's Fridays event will be the same time on Center Periphery Politics in Russia, Instability and Adaptation, with presentations also from international panelists Ira Busigina, Stephen Crowley, Katerina Koldunova, and Andrei Semyonov. So please join me in thanking our panelists, and I will hope to see you again sometime soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much.